Grant. So on to our speaker for this evening. Jonny Dillon is an archivist at the National Folklore Collection at UCD, which is a tradition archive which was inscribed to the UNESCO Memory of the World Register in December 2017. Jonny produces and hosts the National Folklore Collection's monthly podcast, Blúiríní Béaloidis. He is also a research editor for the Folklore Collection's online platform, Dúchas.ie, which will be the main source for this evening's lecture. And he's also the Honorary Treasurer to the Folklore of Ireland Society. And our lecture this evening is entitled Online Folklore Collections from County Offaly, an Exploration of Dúchas.ie. So over to you, Jonny.
Thanks very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and actually give just a brief warning before we start. I'm in a pretty rural location where the internet has a tendency to sometimes disappear at the perfect moment. So if I disappear and drop off into the void, don't worry. I've discussed it with Karen already. I'm going to call back into the meeting on the phone, so there may be some technical hiccups. And so, as mentioned there, I'm going to talk this evening, I suppose, mainly to look at our well, a couple of different things. I suppose I want to look at a bit about the history of the Irish Folklore Commission, which is now the National Folklore Collection in University College Dublin, and the archives that are held there. I want to talk a bit about, I suppose, a background to the Folklore Commission, who was involved with it, and I want to look at some of the fieldwork collections, in particular, one scheme that some of you, some attendees here may be familiar with, and others may not be that familiar with. And it's the schools folklore scheme, the schools collection, which is a fantastic scheme in and of itself, but it also relates, is pertinent just to the site, to Dúchas.ie, and to anybody with a particular interest in lore and traditions and customs and folk traditions collected from County Offaly, because a lot of that material from the schools collection is now available online, unlike some of our other collections which are in a process of being put online, basically. So look at the schools collection, the background to the collection, some of the examples from it, and then I'm going to take it through some screenshots kind of from the site. Again, because I'm a bit dubious about my internet connection, I don't want to share the screen and actually be on the website and clicking around just in case everything implodes. But I just have some screenshots and layouts from the site, just so people have a bit of an idea of how to do some research that they might want to, basically, on the website. And again, please put hard questions into the chat box and then we can go through them later on. So the Irish Folklore Commission was established in 1935 by this figure, Seamus O'Delarga, you can see on the left-hand side here. A very charismatic figure. I suppose he studied under Douglas Hyde, who became Ireland's first president, and who was also heavily involved in the Gaelic revival. And Delargy worked with him as a student, and under him worked kind of as I suppose Hyde is very much a mentor to Delargy's. And Delargy then established Folklore of Ireland Society with Hyde and others in 1927. The first meeting was in 1926. In November 13th, 1926, in around St. Stephen's Green in Dublin. And basically what they wanted to do was to collect and to kind of preserve for posterity the folk traditions of the Irish people, those stories, songs. You see this quote from Delargy here, these tales, songs and traditions, which he referred to as the state papers of a forgotten and neglected people. And so the impetus, I suppose, from Delargy's perspective was there was the idea that Gaelic culture was in danger of disappearing, in danger of slipping into oblivion in the way kind of urbanization and modernization. And so what the Folklore Society and later the Folklore Commission wanted to do was to collect and harvest and give a kind of, I suppose, collect and preserve for posterity those traditional literatures and customs of the Irish people, essentially. And so the commission itself grew out of, as I mentioned, the Folklore of Ireland Society. The Folklore of Ireland Society is still on the go. It publishes a journal every year. It's a popular society, so you can become a member and join the society. But in the editorial of that journal, Delargy first penned these instructions on the collections of folklore. So the first kind of organized, structured approach where instructions were given on how to collect folklore in, say, quite a kind of a rigorous fashion, I suppose, were given in comparison with some of the 19th century collections, which were of a much more literary and artistic bent. And so suppose Dillon was a very charismatic individual, a very inspiring individual, not a very well-rounded individual, I think it's fair to say, but geniuses seldom are. And so he managed to gather around him really a fantastic body of kind of field workers, or to bring people into the cause, essentially to collect aspects of folk tradition. So this quote from him here, he says, "Household of Irish historical studies, manuscript and printed sources have been noted and exploited, and the results of archaeological investigation have been utilized, but there still remains for the student of our literary, social and economic history an untapped source, namely oral tradition, or better still, the spiritual and material culture of the Irish country folk. In this historical lumber room of forgotten lore, of traditions, songs, tales, music, dance, peasant crafts, and agricultural methods, there is much rich material not only for the historian, but for the student of the Irish language and literature, and for the artist, the poet, and the economist. These tales, songs, and traditions are indeed state papers of a forgotten and neglected people." So, I suppose, again, you'll see some of the biases of the Commission coming through in Dillon's early quotes. It's very much a kind of bias really the Commission had in its early days, and there's this idea of material that for which there are no formal records that needs to be gathered and collected. That's one of the essential aspects of this collection. So Dillon and had, I suppose, his right hand man, and he was another figure, Sean O'Sullivan, a hugely inspiring figure. And when the Folklore Commission was established in 1935, Dillon employed Sean O'Sullivan, who he had met through his work with the Folklore of Ireland Society and the Irish Folklore Institute, a short-lived kind of folklore collecting initiative that was established in 1930. And O'Sullivan was employed as the archivist for the Commission, and he was immediately sent to Sweden. He was sent to Uppsala and to the Folklore and Dialect Archive there. And while in Sweden, in the same way that Dillon had similarly been inspired by the Swedes when he travelled there, went abroad to learn about the real scope of folk tradition, O'Sullivan wrote here, "It was only when I went to Uppsala that I saw the real scope of folklore. Many of the people in Ireland think of folklore as merely folk tales and riddles and proverbs, but working with Herman Gare, Sven Lilleblad and Oka Campbell completely wiped that idea out of one's mind." So it's important, just before we look at some of the material or look at some of the content from the skills collection from Offaly in particular, that these early explorations, I suppose, and the influence of the Swedish scholars and Nordic scholars in particular, and German scholars indeed as well, had a profound impact on the likes of O'Sullivan and Dillon, and that they opened out the scope of what folk tradition was. It's not just old stories, which is usually what students first think of when I ask them what's folk tradition, what is folklore. But really what we're looking at are the informal, traditional, communal, often oral customs of the people, if they're represented through material culture, through trades, crafts, livelihoods, recipes, or social folk custom, rites of passage, popular belief and custom, and so on, or narratives. So as long as it's this informal, traditional, kind of communal, anonymous often expressions, these are the type of cultural expressions that Dillon wanted to collect, essentially, unlike the type that you'd find in a formal archive, essentially, right? This is the kind of the unofficial culture of the people, is in their view, what's being collected. So Dillon and O'Sullivan, having established the Folklore Commission, they set about the task of kind of harvesting this material, essentially. And to that end, they employed, with the Folklore Commission, they were able to employ full-time and part-time field workers. And because, again, we're dealing with records for which there are no or expressions often for which there are no written records, folklore collectors had to be sent into the field to conduct field work. You had to take photographs, to look at sketches, and people had to go and interview people, identify informants, so-called, which is kind of somewhat unfortunate term that we've kind of borrowed from the Swedes and still used these years later. Not quite informers, but not far off. Informants were identified, and then narratives were collected from them, or aspects of custom and belief, or examples of different trades and crafts and so on. So you can see here in this series of photographs a rough kind of outline of the workflow of the folklore collector, essentially. So in the top right-hand corner, you have James Largus, James Hamilton Largus, sat at the foot of Sean Daltoon, that's in County Waterford in 1948. You can see they're supping away on what looks like a very sunny day, or bottles of Guinness. And Joe Daly there's buttoned up in his tie and so on. So a fine day's work. Probably wouldn't get away with that today. And so they're working away, conducting these recordings. And in that instance, in 1948, they were traveling around using an acetate disc cutting machine. So they're actually conducting audio recordings. quite high, kind of really high quality recordings that they were traveling and had used to record from people. On the left-hand side, you see a more rudimentary device that is very common and used by the field workers for the commission. That's the Edaphone wax cylinder machine. And this really was just an aid to dictation, in the sense that informants would recite, say, narratives, or you'd speak into it and cut onto a wax cylinder in the same way that a groove is cut into a vinyl would be this audio trace. The quality was pretty poor, really. The signal kind of path of the medium itself and the audio recorder are kind of as loud as each other, so it's a very scratchy, screechy kind of material to use. But nonetheless, huge amounts of material was recorded onto the cylinders, most of which don't survive. There wasn't a budget to keep all of them, so they were shaved blank. But what does survive was, as you can see here with Kieran Barry, a very detailed account of the material that was recorded by the collector, word for word, transcribed without any corrections or to the grammar or amendments or anything like that. These cylinders and the notepaper by the collector, the transcriptions, were sent back to HQ, where Sean would and like pour over them, basically, and kind of scold collectors if they got pieces wrong. They check the audio against the transcription, basically. And then again, you see Kieran Barry here just jotting down notes from Sean Vicky Green in Russellville, 1966. So there are different kind of levels and methods and modes and degrees of folklore collecting, from the use of a jotter to the acetate recording machine and the Edaphone machine. But basically, collectors would travel out among the people, often working on localities, on environments. They could understand the dialect, and secondly, where people would trust them and talk to them when they're asking strange questions altogether, basically. So this was the work of the early work of the Folklore Commission in employing the field workers, essentially, to travel around parts of the country, all over the island of Ireland, across the 32 counties, and to collect basically from people. So for this first year of the Commission's existence, it was working from 82 St. Stephen's Green in Dublin, and it amassed around 35,000 pages worth of material in the first year. And so it was quickly realized, though, despite, I suppose, the amount of material they were collecting in the field, that actually there was an enormous body of material that was kind of eluding them, or that was escaping them. So we have a couple of quotes here. This leads in now, apart from the work of the full-time and part-time adult collectors, to the schools collection material I want to talk about. This is, I suppose, is a very unparalleled scheme, really, in which an entire generation of senior pupils, school children, were tasked with the collection of folklore, documentation of folk tradition from their own townlands up and down the country. And so you have a quote here from Sean Dillon in the Irish Independent on the 3rd of October 1938. And he says that the Commission saw some time ago that at the current rate of progress, the traditions of the greater part of the country must await collection for decades, and much valuable material of a traditional kind would, as a result, be lost forever. One of the things that you see in a lot of the early discussions or kind of writings or narratives around the documentation of folklore is this idea that it's perishing, basically, and that the fragments need to be kind of gathered up and collected lest they perish, right? Even the motto of the Folklore of Ireland Society is from the Gospel of John: gather up the fragments that remain lest they perish, lest they be lost. Again, another quote here from Sean Dillon, reflecting on his work later on. This is from 1953. He says, "Small though Ireland is, it has many a house and many a glen to which you would never go if you were collecting. If we could get the school children in Ireland to help in collecting, a great lot of areas would be tapped which we would never hope to cover by our full or part-time collectors." So it's quite a genius idea, really. You employ slave labor, you get the children of nations into what is regarded as quite a patriotic task. And this idea, you'll see the foreword for this booklet that O'Sullivan compiled, a booklet called Irish Folklore and Tradition. And he writes that the collection of the oral traditions is a work of national importance, right? This is how it was described. And it was a work of national importance, and it's an incredible body of work now which has been collected. And despite, I suppose, or notwithstanding that national importance, it's also, I suppose, kind of have to say as well, it's an enormous local importance, and local for family members who maybe had to contribute, but also for people who want to find out about their own local area, about their own local land, or for people who are, again, more interested just in certain aspects of tradition or custom. You can zoom in the folk in the schools and look at all of the customs that hang on a certain town or parish or county or area or province, whatever. So it's a very dynamic collection in that regard. And again, ahead of its time in the sense of how it went about kind of creating or collecting these records, really, in recruiting an entire generation of school children to the cause. So here's an example of More and More National School in County Donegal around the time that the scheme would have been initiated. It came into effect in July 1937. I'm sorry, that's a typo I have up there, 1939. It finished up in 1938. It was meant to run for the school year through 1937. It was extended then for 6 months at the end, towards the end of the scheme. And basically what the commission, what Sulivan and Glargy managed to do was to convince the INTO, the teachers union at the time, and the Department of Education to put the collecting of folklore onto the school's curriculum, where every Friday the teacher would take a subject that had been with a series of prompts and questions that had been set by Sulivan, and the children would go through these prompts and questions with the teacher. They then go to their parents and grandparents and the elderly people in the community, and you'd have these young people then collecting from the elderly people in their area, writing down into their homework copybooks, and then rewriting into these larger notebooks that were then bound and paginated, catalogued, and all sent back to the Folklore Commission. And that is the main body of the school's folklore scheme today. Participants today, I suppose, would be in their mid-90s. There are not many remaining now. So some details about the collection. There were upwards of 4,000 schools took part, approximately 40,000 to 50,000 senior pupils. So again, these are the kids in 6th class. Because there wasn't an automatic kind of transition into what we call secondary school, high school now, from a broad system, the age range tended to be a bit older than what we'd usually expect of senior pupils in primary school now. It went from around 11 years of age to about 16 years of age. These are roughly the children who are collecting under the scheme. 1,124 manuscript volumes from 26 counties. This scheme didn't extend into Northern Ireland. They couldn't guarantee cross-border cooperation with I suppose the body, the Northern Irish equivalent of the Department of Education. Separate manuscript volumes that the children compiled. We also have about 18,000 of their original homework copybooks. These aren't digitized. A small amount of them are digitized and put online, but in the main, these aren't put online. So these represent another very interesting area for research. As regards material from Offaly in particular, the NFCS 800 to 822, so 23 manuscript volumes were returned from Offaly, consisting of about 6,840 pages from 92 schools. So there's a considerable body of material there from Offaly that people can check out and have a look at. This I just want to run through as an example of some of the prompts, I suppose, that were given to the children that they had to compile. So this is, I suppose, what kind of archivists, librarians, people working with information nowadays and digitizing collections would refer to as metadata. I know your video screens are all off, but I'm sure people are rolling their eyes at the hearing mention of the word metadata. We hear about it all the time nowadays, but it's extremely important, and it's very, I suppose, important in the context of this scheme that there was such a focus on information about the information that was being collected. Basically, who was collecting this, where was it collected, who did you hear it from, all of these kind of practical details around the information that is often sorely lacking in a lot of the 19th century more literary artistic sources that we look at when we look at collections of folk tradition and narrative and so on. Never mind the often very kind of overblown and embellished language in those collections, but there's often a lack of some of the more just concrete details from whom was this collected, that sort of stuff. That was very important for the Folklore Commission and for what was called the historic geographic method at the time, where variants are traced and plotted, and you kind of have to see how many versions come from a certain area. It's quite a mathematical and dry process in a way, really, which leaves out some of the kind of contextual matter of the importance of folk tradition. But these details essentially are extremely important, and they were recorded by the children. So you'll see the pupil should enter at the end of each composition his or her name and address, and the name and address of the person or persons from whom the material was obtained. And then it has details. It's every composition, irrespective of length, is valuable provided the matter has been obtained locally. The exact location of each place, rock, road, lake, etc., mentioned in the composition must be given, townland, parish, and county being stated. Right. So again, it's a work of national importance, but it's also a work of local importance. And I suppose when you zoom out, you can see trends and customs and traditions as they spread across the country. But when you zoom in, you can also see a kind of three-dimensional flavor of life in a place. And for anyone doing family history or genealogical studies, these kind of records have a huge impact, really. They kind of jump off the page in a way sometimes that a census form or census return or something won't. Not that they don't have their own impact as well, it's just that these kinds of records, as we'll now see, they have a great emotional resonance to them, I think, that they've been written by the children. And these are just some of the topics. I'll skim through these quickly. But these prompts were compiled by the Commission, and they are based on items known to some tradition. Right? So examples of hidden treasure, funny stories, a collection of riddles, local heroes, so let us say local strongmen, people who could walk great distances, or fast runners or high jumpers and so on, great singers and dancers. Local happenings, shipwrecks, drownings, severe weather, again, local place names, bird lore, local cures. You have a lot of material even around games I play, children's games and so on and so forth. So to a certain degree, the collection is tailored to the children who are collecting it, right? But also historical accounts were recorded, religious traditions, particularly around holy wells, popular belief and custom. And so really a broad array. And like I said, each week the teacher would go through a topic and would list through the questions with the children, who would then go away and berate their parents and grandparents with hard questions about holy wells. Essentially, this is the idea. They would write that into the little copybooks that we saw, and then they would rewrite them into what we're going to look at now. These are the larger volumes, the kind of the manuscripts, the final manuscript page, which consisted of a 100-page notebook that were all sent back to the Folklore Commission, and then they were bound into these manuscripts. So number 800 was the first manuscript from Offaly, and that might have 2 or 3 notebooks from schools in a certain barony or parish, or near one another, basically. And so that runs on for whatever, upwards of 90 schools in these 23 manuscript volumes, around 7,000 pages, all handwritten by the children in their beautiful writing, you will note. I can't read my own writing, so it's always nice. It's one of the first things that people notice. So where else to start but with my home district? This is a common topic that you see replicated, kind of asked over and over and over through the schools collection. But in it, you get a great, I suppose, account of population groups, local inhabitants, how many people are in the area, what are the surnames, does anyone speak Irish, how many houses are there, any of the roofs thatched, these sorts of details. So you'll see here, I live in the town and townland of Edenderry, in the parish of Monastery. There are about 500 families in the town. The name most common is O'Connor. Edenderry means the brow of the oak, on account of an oak wood on a hill beside the town. There are about 30 old people living in the town, and one man can speak the Irish language. A good number of people went to America. There are 2 woods in Edenderry, Clonmullen and one behind the church. There are the ruins of an old castle in this wood. The River Boyne is about a mile from the town and supplies the town with water. There's a branch of the Grand Canal coming into Edenderry. The school in which I am writing this was built in 1803 and cost, together with the house at the back, £153. And actually I can't read the old money, some of the 10 shillings or 10 something others and 0 something else, but a considerable degree of money we can assume. But again, just it's a nice introductory kind of overview of the home district, and that will be found in each manuscript from each part of Offaly over and over and over. This topic will be covered, the same topics are covered, so the same questions are being asked, but their answers always vary from place to place as far as family names, the meanings of place names, and kind of, I suppose, aspects of the home district that stand out. Again, it's very hard to give anything other than a very cursory overview because of the scope and extent and depth indeed of this material as well, but we shall plow on. So looking at, apart from my home district, there's also an examination of kind of livelihood and household support, crafts, occupations, trades, again, active material culture that people mightn't necessarily think of when they think of folklore. They don't think of old stories, but material culture is an enormously important part of folk life, so-called, of the study of folk tradition. So in a sense, you have the importance really in documenting crafts. Often, I suppose, there was a focus in earlier times on kind of pre-industrial crafts or crafts that were kind of in the shadow of the Industrial Revolution, saying that there wasn't an Industrial Revolution in Ireland, but rural crafts, rural industries often were the focus of the Commission in its early days in particular. And this is an example here, corrected by Margaret M. Keenan from Cregan, County Offaly. Sorry, I should say the last piece there was collected by Beryl Holt in Edenderry, County Offaly, from the Protestant school in Edenderry. Protestant schools did take part as well, though actually, as an aside, it's worth noting some of the kind of the biases that were by the Commission. Really, there wasn't huge interest in the lives of Protestants of independent Ireland, really, by the Folklore Commission in its early days. Deirdre Nuttall has written a fantastic book about that recently, which I advise people to look at. Another bias that you find expressed in the Commission at this stage is very much a rural bias over an urban bias. So in inner city Dublin, for example, there's no material from the school's collection. It was regarded as kind of, we don't need the information from these areas. We're spitting that slightly crudely, but essentially that's what the view was, that it was seen as it didn't need to be applied in areas like kind of inner city Cork, Waterford and Dublin city centre and so on. They kind of built up urban areas, really. So there's an early rural bias. There are gaps and kind of blind spots in this collection, as there are in all collections. Now, sorry, old crafts. There were many industries carried on in this part of the country in olden times. Some of them are dead out, some of them are dead out now, such as weaving, making and tanning of leather. There are some in operation still, such as brick making, thatching, wheel making, burning lime, kish making, rope making. The most common craft in this place is thatching. Nobody but an expert hand would be allowed to put a thatch on a house. All the old types of houses are thatched. People say that oaten straw is the best for thatching. It has to be trimmed and dressed before it is used for thatching. The thatch is kept on scallops, which are pointed rods. So there are simple accounts given. They don't go into huge detail often. Something you find with the main collection, whereas adults talking to other adults who go into really minute levels of detail around old crafts, often accompanied by sketches and drawings as well. Some fantastic material artwork. Apart from kind of examinations of, say, the local district, town and its inhabitants, or trades and craft and so on, you find a lot of material really that reflects aspects of life at the time, kind of social context. So even strange experiences that people would have coming home on kind of unlit rural roads at night, basically, and often narratives in that regard, or in particular narratives with a certain supernatural or otherworld bent to them. This is an example of the Dead Coach. This is collected from Angela Flannery and Claran. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly at all. Apologies if I'm butchering that name. In Offaly. She writes, a long time ago, a man with no head used to pass down the Creeva Road at 12 o'clock every night and keep going until he landed at Charlton's house. After him came a dead coach, and all the people were terribly afraid. They used to say that it was a terrible thing to be out after 12 o'clock in case they'd meet the coach. This coach used to come from a lake in County Leitrim. A coach like it goes on every road in Ireland, and it makes a loud rumbling noise. All the people are afraid of it because when it passes, they say somebody on that road is going to die. You can see then at the bottom of the manuscript page, it says it was told to Angela by her father, Stephen Flannery. So you have a sense, I suppose, a lot of these, it's an example really, I guess, of a kind of a legend as far as folk narrative goes, unlike the kind of Cinderella's and kind of Jack and the Beanstalk, long ago, far away, happily ever after type stories. These are shorter narratives. They're often rooted in kind of in the locality, right? It goes down the Creeva Road, it goes to this person's house. Or my father saw it, or my grandmother saw this, or whatever. So there's always kind of a more of an historical kind of bent to these sort of narratives, which are often much shorter as well than some of the longer multi-episodic kind of folk tales that would have been collected as well. More on the supernatural, the fairies, huge material regarding the fairies, which again nowadays in many instances, we talk to people, Irish people in particular, about fairies, and kind of snigger or roll their eyes, whatever. But there's a certain degree of maybe passive belief still exists. If you're then to ask people if they chop down a hawthorn tree and bring it into their sitting room, they might kind of grow a bit pale, or if they plough a fairy fort, or blow it up on their land or whatever, they might have a different perspective necessarily. So, but certainly there's a lot of lore and legend regarding the fairy host, who really should be thought of, I suppose, in tradition, in the sense of folk tradition, as a kind of an otherworld community who live alongside us in the natural landscape, really, who can help or hinder. Not so much as the literary kind of Tinkerbell type manifestations, the kind of Victorian Tinkerbell kind of thing. This instance here, again, this is from somebody who's kind of coming home late at night. Often you have stories about, that advise against staying out too late. Don't be playing cards till all hours and coming home, because, you will meet the dead coach or the fairies sweep you away, whatever. But there are many stories in this regard. So one night, my grandmother was going to her brother's house and on the cab, okay. As she was passing by a little hollow, she saw about 10 little men hurling. Each of them was dressed in a little green coat and a red cap on his head and a pair of green shoes on his feet. She wasn't afraid of them, When she was coming home, they were there again, and she heard each one of them say, "A ball and a hurl for me, a ball and a hurl for me." She said she didn't mind them for fear they would take her away with them. That is to say, she didn't have anything to do with them. Not that she didn't mind they were there, that she ignored them for fear they would take her away with them. Many different accounts, I suppose, of the fairies that we see in tradition as well. Some of them where it's, an old woman comes to the door and asks for lend of something, or a strange man, or a strange woman, or whatever, that they're not necessarily always these little people wearing strange clothes. Sometimes they'll appear like that. Sometimes it'll appear like a neighbor. Sometimes they'll look like somebody you recognize. Sometimes they'll appear as your husband or wife. Sometimes they'll appear as somebody who died in the locality a while ago. So there's a lot of strange and different manifestations of them, basically. And again, they can help or hinder. They're not kind of morally evil, but are a source often of danger, or imagined as a source of danger in folk tradition. And we're part and parcel, I suppose, of oral literature and tradition for our forebears for a long time in this country. There are a great many narratives regarding them, legends regarding them. But again, an example, I suppose, of a very, very common kind of legend that you'll find across the country, this idea of the fairies at night that are being seen to playing hurling or playing football, or other accounts where they're maybe having a battle against each other, two warring parties from the Munster fairies and the Connacht fairies that are having a war against each other, or there's or say where they're hunting cross country, or where somebody will meet a fairy funeral coming home and so on. They mirror our own community in different ways, and are often met on these kind of liminal places at the edge of the town, or up on the edge of a hill, or whatever, where the ordered realm of human existence stops and it kind of turns into the natural realm, right? This is often where they're met, and again, where you need to take care, especially at late at night, as it were. To change tack slightly and look to another example from which a lot of material was collected, and that encompasses aspect of folk medicine and cures in particular. Generally, I suppose, when we're looking at cures and thinking about folk medicine, they split into kind of two separate camps, or maybe it's not, you can't split them too easily maybe, but there are two kind of broad areas into which you can divide aspects of folk medicine. The first focuses often on magic and ritual, recitations, charms, and so on, and then the second is more mundane, looking at the use of herbs and poultices and mold and things like this before penicillin was kind of even discovered or whatever, distributed widely. So you have two aspects, basically. One which looks at, often uses magic and symbolism and kind of likeness and opposites in a way to kind of cure with a certain amount of ritual expression, whatever. And then others which use kind of herbs and so on. So here's an example. Again, it's often kind of mild as well. The types of ailments, often whooping cough, warts, sore eyes, really, really common, sore throats, jaundice, all kind of, I suppose, yeah, it's interesting even the types of ailments that are listed in the school's collection. They're reflective of their time often. So warts, you see the manuscript here, it says, the people get a black snail and let it creep on their warts. Then they stick the snail on a thorn, and according as the snail dies, the wart wears away. The snail got a bit of a rough deal there. This is something that I remember as a child, and certainly listeners from Ireland will almost certainly, some of you will have heard as well. If you have a wart, you rub a snail on it and you put the snail on the thorn, and as the snail kind of dies and melts away, your wart will melt away. This is an example of what's called sympathetic magic, the idea that you can transfer an ailment or an illness from one object to another through some sort of ritual, basically. And it's the same principle that applies to a voodoo doll, right? You kind of stick pins in the eyes of a voodoo doll, and suddenly your arch nemesis sitting somewhere else away puts pain in their eyes, right? So there's no literal kind of material connection between these two things, but there's some symbolic connection between them, say. So another often kind of cure for warts would be to take a stone, a little pebble for each wart, put it in a bag, and leave the bag at a crossroads. And then when somebody picks up the bag, some poor unfortunate, and looks at it and see, then they'll get all the warts, and they'll kind of magically be transferred from you to some poor unfortunate, basically. Another account here regarding warts: a bottle of forge water is got from the forge and rubbed on the wart for 9 mornings, and that cures. Again, the water that the blacksmith used, and the blacksmith are a huge amount of, and so that forge water was often used. Whooping cough: a green worm is got and is tied in a little bag around the neck of the child. As the whooping cough and as according as the worm dies, the whooping cough dies away. Again, you're transferring it to this little worm. The sick child of the whooping cough is made creep under a white horse. This is something that is maybe an example of one where the full kind of tradition isn't expressed. It's expressed in more detail in other accounts, where what often happened around the country is that a child would be passed over and under a donkey several times by one adult to the next, over the belly of a donkey and back over several times in order to rid them of the ailment. Other instances where people would rid themselves of ailment sometimes by crawling under a double-ended briar, or crawling through a kind of tight space between two rocks, or crawling through a tight space to do that as you crawl through, the ailment is kind of left behind, basically. This example where it says about creeping under a white horse would be maybe a confusion with another tradition regarding the whooping cough, where one of the cures was to go outside the house, and first man on white horse to ask him to cure whooping cough and do whatever he says. So if he says, eat some bread, or take some water, or don't do anything, you do that and it'll make it go away. I heard a reference that may have been to some part of it, was Galway or Sligo, that doctors rode around on white horses, and so there was some association. I'm not sure if that's the case at all. Either way, a lot of the time as well, you don't need even to explain it in some sort of rational or reason. Like, you can just look at the symbolic kind of content of it for the explanation, and that's me. Sore eyes, again, hugely regarding sore eyes. To cure sore eyes, the people got a gooseberry thorn and prod the sty with it for 9 mornings. So if you thought rubbing snails and warts was bad, then they bury the thorn, and according as it rots, the sty dies away. Again, so you have this idea of sympathetic magic. It's repeated kind of countless times in different ways in across the collection, not just for folk cures, but also for magically attacking your neighbours if it's blind and so on, burying eggs on their land or burying meat on their land, and as it rots, all their good fortune goes away, all this sort of stuff. So sympathetic magic is part and parcel of what we see with folk cures. Here's an example then on the other side, where it takes herbs and so on, and discusses it. Monks get a piece of laurel leaf and roast it and then put it around the neck and the face. The cure for sore throat is said to be dandelions, boil them and drink the broth. Get a piece of hex and boil it. It's for jaundice, to drink the liquid while it is warm. So you'll find a lot of things like about garlic for cleaning the blood, or again using moldy poultices and so on. So there is some kind of reasonable explanation behind a lot of these things as well. Another area which may interest people are local accounts of kind of hugely traumatic, or the huge historical events of Irish history, from 1798 or various uprisings and rebellions to the Great Famine, and to say even landlordism or the Land League, up even to, I suppose, the War of Independence and so on. The collection then, being as it was collected in 37, it kind of stops. You don't really find material regarding the Civil War in the schools collection too much. Not a huge amount anyway, and I suppose sometimes some of these customs, or not customs, some of these memories don't really become communal memories until maybe a generation passes, and then people can kind of talk about them a bit more freely than they might when the root wounds are still a bit raw, as it were. But we have a lot of interesting accounts regarding the famine, for example. So here, this account says in the year of 1846, it was a great famine that affected this district very much. The year before the famine, the potatoes were so plentiful that the people threw loads of them in the ditch to stop gaps. At that time, there were houses built to make porridge for the people. There was every kind of dirt mixed through it, and the people took diseases from it and died. There was one house in Ballinmore, another in Glasshouse. At that time, there was a priest in Shinrone named Father Martin Kennedy, who did a great lot for the people. Anything he had, he gave it to them. He used to eat only 1 meal a day, and he gave the rest to the people. And the people afterwards died and was buried next to the altar in Shinrone Chapel. A lot of these accounts, these kind of accounts, folk histories of kind of large-scale events, they can be used sometimes to supplement kind of more formal records, but also they could just be used to give an account of what was the popular opinion of not what actually happened necessarily, but what was the popular view of what happened, or what was the popular view of a certain figure, like Cromwell or something like that, right? Often there are strange narratives about Cromwell where he's kind of he's obviously admired in a weird way in the narrative sometimes. So you have interesting kind of crossovers and counter narratives regarding some of these great historical events that, like I said, they can supplement the formal record, but they can also just show popular opinion to certain events or how these kind of schisms manifest in society. The dividing of Monaghan and Clonmacnoise, so it's an example of apocryphal religious tradition. So again, it's a view of religious tradition, but not from an official kind of doctrinal standpoint of the church per se, but from how are saints and these kind of figures locally worshipped, and how are they talked about. One day, St. Monaghan and St. Kieran were talking of dividing the parish. They came to the conclusion they would arise early the next morning and walk until they would meet each other. St. Monaghan arose early and started on his journey, expecting to meet St. Kieran, but at last he reached Clonmacnoise and found that St. Kieran was yet sleeping. Then St. Kieran said that he would throw his nightcap, and wherever it would light, that would be the dividing place. St. Monaghan was delighted, thinking that he would not go far. But when St. Kieran threw it, a storm arose, and the cap fell about 300 yards from the crossroads of Doon. Take that. This divided the two townlands. The storm at that time is called Cairns Wind. You know, you'll find a certain kind of crossover with figures like St. Bridget and her mantle, that kind of flattens the curve of Kildare when she asks for a little bit of kind of land for a church, and is mockingly said, "You can have as much as this mantle will cover." And the same with St. Kevin and Glendalough, where he asks the chieftain for some land for a church, and is mockingly told, "You can have as much land as that lane goose can cover," and suddenly its wing is healed and it flies all over the valley and lands in 7 places, and that's where the churches are manifested. So these kind of humorous, I suppose, aetiological descriptions, you know, this is why this place name is so, or this is why this large rock is here, and so on and so forth, right? These very localized accounts, but again, an apocryphal perspective of religious tradition. These is just in brief before looking at Dúchas, the site, for example, the old school kind of finding aid that anyone who would have come to the Folklore Commission or the National Folklore Collection to our reading room looking at the school's collection would have been intimately familiar. These are the topics laid out on the left and the page numbers that relate to a specific manuscript, in this instance, manuscript number 87. And so this was the way that you search through this material. Again, you know, the tradition archive is more like a library than a formal archive, in that we ask questions around subjects and item level kind of descriptions of subjects. These are the kind of things that just the types of questions that we ask, I suppose, require that we arrange our holdings in accordance with subjects, more like a library than an archive in a sense. So, so all of these subject kind of headings are all given their own individual page numbers and so on, and that was the way that this was catalogued, right? So it was quite, to put it politely, a blunt instrument as far as finding aids go, and you really need to kind of find a way around it. Now to look at Dúchas.ie to show, I suppose, how with digitization, a lot of this material is opened up in ways that really we couldn't have conceived of, and certainly the likes of D'Largy and O'Sullivan in initiating this scheme back in the 30s couldn't even have dreamed of, really. And never mind, you know, if you go back to the quotes that I started at the start of this talk, where there was the discussion that O'Sullivan, or that piece where he talks about needing to basically preserve this material before it's kind of disappears into oblivion or whatever. Now, not only is it kind of kept and stored and controlled and preserved in the archives of the National Folklore Collection, but now with it's being digitized and using the metadata that they collected, we can now then beam it, project it back out into the communities from whence it came, back to people whose families contributed, back to people who grew up or who live in the areas that are now being here described, whatever. I remember when I first looked at the school's collection account from where I grew up in Greystones, County Wicklow, my mind was just blown by it. It was just, you just enter a new world of these kind of strange legends and narratives, and it's a strange mix of the familiar and the totally unfamiliar. So that's quite an impact. And so now we can share this material in a much kind of broader way, which is of huge benefit and importance, I think. So when you log on to the site, onto Dúchas.ie, you'll see in the top left, there's a kind of ticker at the top, and you see collection. You click that and you'll go into schools collection, and you will be met with this this kind of header, the schools collection, right? What could possibly go wrong? And then you'll see a list on the left hand side, a list of counties, and you scroll down and you can click on Offaly. When you click on Offaly, it will bring you all of the volumes, all of the manuscript volumes from County Offaly. So you'll see here on the left-hand side, volume 800 in the center corner. Volume 800, Bracknell 1, Bracknell 2, which I've seen with the Protestant schools there, and then Bracknell County Offaly, and Clonbelow, Esker, Edenderry Boys, Edenderry St. Mary's Convent, Edenderry 2, Gar, Rhodes, Blúiríní, Kilmurray, etc. Right? So you can click on each of the schools, you can see again, as you go through, you can see, okay, I'm not interested in that area. You'll come into a townland or into a certain parish and then out again. So you'll kind of, yeah, you'll see as you go through the map, it'll move in a coherent way through the county into an area that you're familiar with and then out of it again, basically. But if you click on any one of those schools, you'll be brought up to the list of stories, right? So this is an example of the pages I was showing you earlier in my home district that was collected. But here it is represented digitally on the site. And again, go back to the metadata that I mentioned, where students have to provide their names, where to reference where this material is collected. And down here, we see at the bottom right-hand side of this page, collector Barry. You can click on her profile. Everything that she contributed to the school's collection will appear. I have material here from my great-grandmother, my grand-aunt in Mullingar. And so I can click on them as individuals. You can search on the tab people, enter a surname, enter a forename, and everything by the individual will come up, all of their stories. So you have on the left-hand side here, titles, story headings, local tradition, Cullenkillis and Cullenkillis Stone, Carrick Castle, local ruins. And you can scroll all the way down through that. All of the different titles are given. You can filter the stories by people, so you could look at just Beryl stories, or if there's a mix, if it's a Brackgaeltacht in an area where there's Irish and English, you can select it just by the language. Then you have the page, the manuscript page, which you can download. Page number is given at the top there, 179 of 210. You can click through onto the next page with that. The archival reference is given. I've kind of cropped that at the bottom, but it's volume 801, page 179. And then you'll notice here, really importantly, my home district, and then the text from the page has been transcribed. And this has changed the collection utterly, because now when you search, when somebody comes on the search page or search site, we don't just search the story titles anymore of my home district. You actually search through the body of the text. So if you're looking for material from Edenderry, but it just says my home district, well, you won't find that until the text has been transcribed and is digitized and is now discoverable and searchable, basically. So that's been a hugely important, development. That's all carried out through Dúchas.ie, which some of you are likely familiar with. You can register and log in for transcription. If this page isn't transcribed, the space where the text is will just be a blank box, and you can really just start typing. You can start writing, or you can just start typing. And so you can see here, we have 348,824 pages in English that have been transcribed, and then 95,514 pages in Irish, all of the school's collection. This isn't available yet for the main collection. You can ask for a story to transcribe, and you can go through it that way. So that's had an enormous impact on the discoverability and what's kind of coming out of these accounts, basically. Another thing that you can do is a map of places. This relates specifically to the school's collection as well. The top one there looks like a bloody COVID distribution map, but this is a list of schools and kind of items from a certain area around the country. So you can go to Tullamore, and as you zoom in, you'll see this other item here. The red tabs are schools, and then the blue accounts are stories that are kind of from those particular areas. You'll see that on the left-hand side, you hover over it, it'll come up my home district. The collectors or the child will come up, and the story title, and you can then go through it that way. Also, then we have a photographic collection. We have about 80,000 photographs in the National Folklore Collection, of which upwards of 11,000 are available on Dúchas.ie. There aren't a huge amount from Offaly, but if you just keep kind of an eye on the site as it goes forward, these will be digitized and added to. We're adding to all this, and it's being refined all the time. So I should say, I barreled straight into discussion about the site. This is a collaboration between ourselves and our colleagues in DCU, Filmschool and Béaloidis. We haven't controlled any of the really technical kind of mastery of all the sort of material. They implemented and created this amazing kind of back end for us, editorial interface that we can add reference numbers, details, add profiles for collectors or profiles for informants. So they created a whole structure behind the site, to which we can then amend all of our finding aids and really kind of bring into the collection. So they're working on that all the time, refining it, and we're working together in adding new parts of the collection, adding new material, new photographs and so on, and new capabilities to it. So this is very much a kind of project, but it's one that has a huge influence and again, resonance for people, because now you can we've made all this material freely available. You can write this photograph here, you download it. Again, you can see these other accounts. or examples of vernacular architecture from around the country. This is a photographer and basket maker. This is Bill Egan. We have wonderful tape recordings of Bill, who from whom Jim Delaney did an enormous amount of collecting, and they just have a great rapport together. So lots of his tapes. That audio isn't online yet. Again, we're working with our colleagues in DCU to implement that, to put a lot of our audio material up onto the site so that people will be able to search through that. But again, it's just to show you maybe some of the examples of the types of material that we have here that were related to Offaly as well. And again, just the photographic items that are there. So you'll see the date, the place is given, the collector, and then a description of the format and so on as well. And this is all downloadable. The main collection, which I'm not going to talk about today, a separate collection, is also going up online by degrees, bit by bit, but it doesn't have the same degree of kind of subject index control and so on that's been applied to the school's collection. But going forward again, it's all going to be added to bit by bit. I'll stop my ranting and raving there, and just to say thanks again for the invitation. I hope everyone enjoyed that brief overview, I suppose, of material held in the National Folklore Collection. Use the site and do get in touch if you have any questions about our collections or how they relate to Offaly. And I'll hand back over to Kieran now to ask some questions. Thanks very much.
Jonny, thank you so much for an excellent presentation on your work, and it was really a wonderful run through, not just some excerpts that you found pertaining to the County Offaly area, but I think especially useful was the actual kind of the last section, the run through or the walkthrough, actually using the website, which I think is very helpful for people.
Yeah, it is, and I mean there are parts of it, I suppose, that it takes a bit of getting used to even to kind of navigate around it, but it's quite malleable in its approach and the way there are lots of different entry points to all this information. So yeah, I'd advise people to get on and play around with it and kind of use it and help us in transcribing it to make it more discoverable and more usable. I see somebody in the chat. I see something that was my aunt. I suppose, was that Margaret Keane that was mentioned? But it's fantastic. This is the yes. It's always the way with the school's collection material in particular. There's an enormous resonance to it. Like regularly, back when it wasn't digitized at all, people would come into the collection and regularly be in tears at material that they'd seen because they discover material from a grandmother or a grandfather or a parent, yeah, so it has a huge effect and kind of impact on people. Again, it's not just dry kind of dusty records or old stories, whatever. It's a living, breathing collection. It relates to very much to who we are and our where we come from, and again, you know, family members and so on are part of it. So I'm delighted that actually somebody had their aunt there.
There's a few things that stood out for me. One was the mention of the story of the headless man, and beware of being on that road when the headless man is there. The other was the 10 fairies playing hurling. And I was struck by they were wearing quite distinctive red and green, which struck me as kind of the Mayo colours. So hopefully they had better luck in their tournament than Mayo to have in recent decades in the football. But one thing, if I may, I'll ask this question and open it up to people's questions in the chat box. You had a throwaway comment where you made reference to a fairy funeral. And have you come upon that before in other parts of the country? What does a fairy funeral actually look like?
Yeah, well, the important thing, I suppose, to bear in mind with all of these customs and traditions is that they don't exist in a vacuum in a singular instance, say. So for folklorists or many folklorists, really, if you were to find one single account of a strange kind of narrative and you weren't to find it anywhere else, then it wouldn't really be regarded as a traditional narrative. It'd be a very individualistic one. So we're looking at communal kind of narratives. So in the same way that you have descriptions of the fairies wearing green and red or playing hurling or playing football, you'll find that all over the country, but it varies from locality and from place to place. But you find the same kind of general themes and things appear. As far as the fairy funeral is concerned, the fairies are intimately bound up in the word of the dead, the word she, which means fairy or kind of otherworld figure, whatever. used to mean a kind of tumulus, a burial mound, a cairn, a kind of death heap of stones. So they're intimately located and bound up with the world of the natural world and the world of the dead. But yeah, the narrative roughly would go that somebody is out carousing or out playing cards or out late at night or whatever, coming home late, and they see a funeral cortege coming down the road, but it's in the dead of night and of strange people, and then they start to recognize some of their own neighbors who are dead, but they're walking in this funeral cortege, and so it's a fairy funeral that the person has been kind of, so it might kind of stop there as a narrative, or it might serve as a precursor into some sort of other strange adventure where the person is swept away or something more sinister happens. But the basic premise, the basic thing, the kind of kernel of it is to meet either strange and dead people having a funeral on the road at night. Not really what you want when you're coming home with a few pints in it from your house.
Of course. One of the questions in the chat box, Jonny, is could Jonny comment on the Jim Delaney collection, and is there much material there for Offaly?
There is a lot, and a lot of tape recordings as well, and a lot of fantastic material with Bill Egan and who else? Willie Rourke, I think, as well. I can't remember the exact addresses and figures now. Jim Delaney did an absolutely fantastic, phenomenal collection, and a lot of lore regarding the supernatural. But his tapes with Bill Egan, William Egan in particular, are marvelous. I love them. There's clearly a great kind of rapport, or friendship, or admiration between them. But yet, a lot of material from Jim Delaney relates specifically to County Offaly. Some of those tapes have been digitized. Not all of them have, and some of the manuscript materials aren't on. Well, his manuscript materials aren't online, so you'd have to come into us and to see that. But what you could do in advance of that would be to contact me, email me, just for a rundown, or even a listing of like what are the tapes that Jim Delaney collected, or what material from Offaly do you have. We can start that kind of work, so you can have an overview of to draw a chalk outline around the body, as it were, like, okay, it's this many tapes, it's these many people or whatever. But certainly Jim Delaney worked extensively in the Midlands, and he made fantastic collections. So yeah, more people should drag out of them and use them, but they're not as widely available as some of the other material yet, but please God, in the future they will be.
Okay, grand. I see another question there, and this is from Aoife Nolan. What is next for the National Folklore Collection? How do you keep it relevant to stop it becoming more and more distant from the present, like museum pieces?
That's a good question. That's a good one. How do you keep it relevant? Well, I suppose, I mean, one of the difficulties really that, the commission in its day had a host or a team of full-time employed folklore collectors who were traveling the country and actively collecting. And we don't have that nowadays. But what we do have, I suppose, are projects that we take on, or that we work with either colleagues or postgraduate students, and we conduct those projects, oversee them, or work with other, say, community groups or local history groups or whatever, to record and document customs and traditions that are kind of being practiced now. Because, as is noted in the question, like, it's hugely important that people don't just think that all of this material is in black and white and relates to the past, and it's kind of some dusty thing on the shelf. It's not. It's part of a living tradition, and it's enormously resonant, and it's important to that we document. The normal now will not be normal in 50 years. It's like taking pictures of fireplaces as they were in the 30s, and they become kind of extraordinary with the passage of time. So what's the NFC doing in that regard? We conduct different projects to sometimes fill some of our own blind spots and gaps. So I mentioned briefly Deirdre Nuttall's folk history of Irish Protestants. Irish Protestants, the Protestants of independent Ireland to be specific, were not a kind of group on which the Commission focused its attentions, and they form, I suppose, a kind of a cultural minority, an Indigenous minority in this country, whose narrative often, there are these counter narratives embedded in their experience of Irishness and so on. So from 2013 to 2017, Dr. Nuttall and then Christopher McCorrick, the director of the NFC, conducted an extensive series of interviews and questionnaires, which have all been transcribed, catalogued, and bound. They'll be bound into the main collection to kind of represent a symbolic kind of filling of the gap. We also have all of those tape recordings, and Deirdre just published her book. We're working with the Liberties Cultural Heritage Cultural Association to document their traditions and customs as well in that part of the inner city. I was conducting recordings in St. Teresa's Gardens in a block of flats that were torn down. Essentially, that was several years ago as well. So there are still active collections going on. And the other thing, you know, how do you keep it relevant? Well, we keep it relevant by digitizing it and making it accessible to as many people as we can. And then people make it relevant, communities make it relevant, because it is relevant to the communities from whom it was collected. So through its use, through its being drawn on, through its being used in the classroom, through its being taught in schools or used whatever by teachers as an education resource, it becomes increasingly relevant. And so we provide access, we control it, we provide access to it. And then, you know, a lot of that question, I suppose, apart from being asked to us, is also a broader question that needs to be asked and answered by us as a community, as a society more generally. What is the role of folk tradition? What is the role of our cultural heritage? Why do we have it? Why do we need it? Why is it important? What purpose does it serve? I think I suppose, you know, I feel quite uncomfortable answering that sort of question, whatever. But for us, it's a question of access and actively kind of collecting what we can, so that this material doesn't just stop. So I could probably rant on about that, but I hope that goes some way to answering the question.
There's another question that you may have actually just answered, and it's from Amanda Pedlow. Any comment on more recent recordings? I think you've covered that.
Yeah, to a degree, I suppose. And then I suppose, you know, there are still projects that will be ongoing this year. Obviously, it's kind of taken a knock as far as like conducting interviews and so on. But there are a lot of recordings, again, that aren't digitized yet, haven't been made accessible yet. And I mean, another hugely important one, again, on the question of relevance, you know, or what is the relevance, is with the survivor stories, a project that was conducted over a couple of years with Professor Emily Pine and, again, Christopher McCoy, the director of the Folklore Collection, where survivors of residential institutions, mother and baby homes, essentially came and kind of gave their stories. They spoke their experience, and that material has been put into the will be bound basically, and kind of put in the that is part of the main collection now as well. Again, so there's a cohort or group of people whose experience is not reflected, I suppose, in many of the records that are of the state, say, and now their voice is heard and that is documented and gathered. So a lot of the work now is kind of collaborative. It's working with other scholars, with colleagues, with local history groups, with community groups. You're not kind of parachuting into an area and kind of with a magnifying glass, and not that the commission's collectors were either, but we're working with groups and with people essentially, and in much tighter kind of ethical controls as well. You know, a lot of the freedoms that would have been around in the 1930s as far as collections and the type of material collected, we wouldn't be able to do today. But so yeah, we are actively, I suppose, still carrying out set projects, but it's on a more ad hoc basis, I'd say.
Okay. There's one question there. There's a comment and then two questions from, I think, John Dolan. And he mentions that looking at the children's handwriting on screen, a huge amount of it seems to be in the old clan, the Shan Close script. And the questions are, I guess this is a question about how can people access or visit the National Folklore Collection? And then also, have you any idea how many of the schools up on Dúchas have now disappeared?
As for the first one, we're open, well, we're closed at the moment, we're totally closed, but generally we're open to the public Monday to Friday from 10 till 5. And you need an appointment, you need to book an appointment with us before you come in. That's kind of often even just to get a sense of what are the materials, just to help kind of guide you through our collections as well and get suitable collections. So we're in UCD, we're in the arts block, the back of the arts block in UCD. And so contact us, make an appointment, and you come and visit. It's no problem. Everyone's more than welcome to visit. But obviously, none of what I've just said applies at the moment under COVID. No one knows when we'll be open again. We're totally closed to the public at present. You can get in touch with any questions, and we'll try and help you remotely as best we can. Any idea how many of the schools have now disappeared? No idea, I'm afraid. But yeah, a good degree, I'm sure, have, where others have kind of since appeared. Not all schools took part. I mean, some schools didn't return material into the scheme. I've also had somebody once come in who was adamant that they had taken part in the collection, and there was just no material from their school. So, excuse me, perhaps the teacher or something hadn't sent it back. But I don't know how many of the schools have disappeared, and a huge amount of material written in the Shankill, the old script. Yeah, you find a lot of that, the old script, particularly with regard to the Irish language material. It's very, very beautiful, yeah.
Muireann has asked, would there ever be another schools collection on such a national scale again?
Yeah, that's another good question. I would love that. I think it'd be fantastic, and it would certainly be it'd be complicated and difficult to organize. Not that it wasn't in the 1930s, but I mean, I think even, you know, the potential for organizing something like that digitally or through the site or whatever is there. But certainly be a lot of work. There's no plan immediately to do it, but I think it's something that would warrant it. It's something that's definitely of value or worth doing. I mean, if I had my way, people would be teaching folklore in the primary and secondary schools curriculum. And, you know, even just to make it, I suppose, again, it goes back to the question of relevance, so that, you know, people are aware of the living and breathing, the kind of dynamic force of this material, that it's not just something that relates purely to the past, but it can kind of orient us and guide us into the future as well. So there's no plan immediately. What we have seen over the years and what we've done sometimes and worked with would be other teachers, say, or individual teachers, or in schools or certain classrooms, where they would initiate a certain project with their own students, and then that material would be kind of deposited to the NFC. That's happened on several occasions. And another thing that we're finding a lot more now is that teachers are using Dúchas.ie in the classroom, so that they're using it a lot more. And I don't know what sort of projects they're necessarily using it to maybe get children to do homework based on some of what they've seen. So will there be another schools collection on such a national scale? I don't know. I hope so, but I don't know, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Rachel McKenna has asked, Johnny mentioned more detailed information given by adults in respective crafts in the main collection. Is this also available online? Yeah, a huge amount of material on crafts. You can, there's a couple of ways you can do it. If you go to the section on topics, under the Photographic Collection, you can look at a section on livelihood and household support, and you get a whole list of different crafts and photographs. There are sketches, drawings, and you can look at the work of Simon Coleman, who made these beautiful and detailed sketches of people thatching, of say, kind of many of those photographs of basket makers, weavers, fishermen, net mending, house building. It goes on and on. So there's an enormous amount of material as far as crafts and kind of physical built culture goes. Yeah. So again, you use the site. You can there's a search box, a kind of text where you can just kind of Google your question. You could type in baskets or something like that. But sometimes you're better off actually going to, on the ticker at the top, you'll see a section that says themes, and then you can pick topics, and then you can pick a set collection. So you go themes, topics, photographic collection, scroll down until you find your craft. Oh, carpenters, there it is, brilliant. And you can see what are the photographs that you have. Because sometimes when you type the word in, the site doesn't read it in the same way as if the photograph's been tagged with a certain subject heading. It's just, I don't know. But yeah, there's a lot of material there. So use the site, go to the themes, topics, photographic collection, and then look at your list of crafts. Okay. A question I had, Johnny, if I may kind of abuse my own position as chairperson, you mentioned how there wasn't much focus on urban centres, like inner city Dublin, and you mentioned Cork City. And I just wonder, first of all, whether it was part of kind of a mid-20th century belief that the urban was less Irish than the rural. But I wonder, kind of drawing or building on that, was there much material from provincial towns? Or was it all from schools, you know, the small two-room schools out in the middle of the country?
No, there's a lot from towns, a lot from provincial towns, market towns, and so on. And there's some material from Dublin, certainly, but as you get into the city centre, it disappears. It's conspicuous in its absence. Was it a part of the view that what was urban was less Irish? I think essentially, yeah. If you look at the introduction, the foreword, Delargy wrote the foreword to Sean O'Sullivan's this book, the Handbook of Irish Folklore, which is kind of the book upon which all of our collections are arranged. And in the foreword, he talks about the shoddy imported culture of the towns. It's pushing back the homespun courtesies of the Gaelic society or something like that. So yeah, and Sean O'Sullivan himself says, you know, your best bet as a folklore collector is to talk to the rural country people. You know, town people have their own customs, yeah, but you know, you'll get the real stuff among the country people. So it was just part of the bias that they had at the time. Again, that was redressed in 1979 to 1980, the Urban Folklore Project was initiated. where upwards of 700 tapes were recorded solely, specifically in the inner cities, basically a vast amount of material in Dublin in particular, and that material is fantastic. So yeah, those kind of gaps were filled in later, but I think essentially, yeah, what you're describing is correct. I think there's a part of, you know, the urban is less Irish, is kind of, or it's yeah, in every remembering there's a forgetting. So we're interested in these people. Well, why aren't you interested in the folk traditions of people in the inner city? It's not that they don't exist. Everyone has folk traditions, but again, what are the customs or traditions that the institution regards as worth collecting? That's where the danger lies. That's where all the crack is. So.
Okay. I'll finish with two questions, and in a moment after those questions, I'll hand over to our president, Helen Bracken. This is another question from Wirren. Do you collect folklore from travellers? And if you do, is that a separate part of the collection itself?
Yeah, there's an enormous amount of material historically collected from the travellers. Again, the Commission is quite forward thinking, although again, a lot of the collections suffer from kind of biases and blind spots. Couple of things to remark on, I suppose. Historically, you have people like PJ Gaynor, who collected a lot from one called Only Power. Only Power was a Longford storyteller, and her son John Power, and their stories were published in the book To Shorten the Road. So we have a lot of their repertoire. So you'd have individual folklore collectors collecting from travellers' stories and so on, because a lot of travellers had certain types of narratives that members of the settler community didn't have. In 1952, I think it was 52 as well, then a questionnaire was sent out by the Commission on travellers. So that was part of the main collection. That's a huge questionnaire series that is available online. You have to email me to access that material. It's hosted somewhere else, not on the Dúchas site. One of the shortfalls or kind of that project, that questionnaire, was that it was largely filled out by settled people as opposed to travellers themselves. So it's a very interesting record and document, but it obviously has it's from a settled perspective, but there is an enormous amount of material, that being said, recorded from travellers themselves, a lot of narratives and stories and songs, like of Only Power and John Riley and so on, who Christy Moore would have gotten the Well Below the Body from. Tom Munley collected a lot of songs from him. So yeah, a lot of material like that. More recently, again, there was a project, what was a TV show called Blood of the Travellers, I think several years ago, with John Connors and others. And that was done with the NFC, and then several kind of members of the travelling community from different backgrounds who would go receive a certain degree of training from the NFC, and then they would go and interview their grandparents, relatives, elderly members of the community, document their customs, and then store that material. That's more recently. So by a representation of kind of population size, they're overrepresented in the collections historically. So there's a lot of material there relating to travellers and of use to travellers, material around gammon, shelton, cant, and stuff like that. But again, with all this stuff, you need to kind of watch where you're setting foot, because a lot of the context behind it needs to be taken into account as well. But yeah, we have a lot of material from travellers. It's not separate; it's just part of the collection. It's either main collection, schools collection, sound archive. It's just we don't split it out that way.
Yeah. Okay. And the last question is from Kieran Keenan, who's wondering, going back to our earlier discussion with fairies, he's wondering about fairies, and we don't hear much about them anymore. He's speculating, is there a rational explanation for this decline in belief in fairies?
Yeah,
any thoughts?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I think it would go hand in hand with increased secularism, and I suppose the collapse of religious thinking for many people in Ireland, at least at a kind of at an explicit level. I think a lot of these things often remain at a more residual or passive level, in a sense where, like I said, if you were to mention the fairies to most people, they might snicker and kind of laugh. In fact, if you were to mention the fairies to many young people nowadays, they mightn't even know what you're talking about necessarily. But some instances of some individuals, your face might grow a bit paler if you're to kind of suggest that they go out and start hacking hawthorn bushes on their land or planting fairy forts. But why don't we talk about them in ways? I think a lot of again, you need to think about the importance or the role that folk tradition plays. There's no equivalent in folk tradition of the appendix in the human body. Folk tradition has a set kind of relevance basically to the social context, and when it stops serving that purpose, it's kind of cleaved off and just stops. So those narratives stop being told. So if people aren't kind of wandering and walking the roads late at night over large distances on kind of with no electricity, and those narratives aren't being recounted or recited or whatever, then they don't manifest in tradition in the same way. But aside from that, I think that there is a general, I would say, increased materialism, secularism, lack of what I would broadly term kind of religious thinking, religious thought, for many people in Ireland. And so with a lot of that, it's not just the fairies who've gotten the chuck, but many, what would you say, expressions of the supernatural or the otherworldly or sacred or the divine, whatever. But that's a kind of different conversation, I suppose. But yeah, I don't know. Is it increase in technology? Maybe has had an impact on how we view the natural landscape, our separation from it, and maybe these things kind of fade away to a certain degree. But there's also the quote I've heard about them, always going, never gone. But they're always there, essentially. So these are some of the different. The perspective for us, in a sense, as folklorists, really is, what is the. It's not are they there or not. It's just what is the purpose that they serve. What is the popular opinion regarding them? What are the conceptions that people have regarding them, and why do they have that, and what sort of function do they serve? In that regard. So, but there's a huge imaginative artistic body of lore, tradition, and custom that we would, it's to our detriment if we suddenly forget and no longer maintain and have. It's intimately bound up with the natural landscape, with this country, the land itself. So I think it's important to bear these things in mind, I suppose. But in short, I don't really know, though, actually, is the answer.
Well, thanks very much, Jonny. I just see two comments, one from our own secretary, Michael Byrne, who says that you can see the Offaly History catalogue of our library for folk books at offalyhistory.com, and our county heritage officer, Amanda Pedlow, has posted up in the chat box. There's lots of recording done recently in Offaly by Maurice O'Keefe at irishlifeandlore.ie, and much of it arranged by Offaly History. CDs can be borrowed and downloaded or for a small fee, and quite relevant to what's going on at the moment. And in recent weeks, many Board na Mona recordings are among that body. So what I'll do now is hand over to our president, Helen Brecken. So I'm just asking Helen to unmute herself and to turn on her video. And I hope this is okay, because I actually didn't say to Helen in advance that I was going to hand over to her. So I hope this goes okay. There's Helen.
Hello, everybody. That was really a marvelous lecture, and it was a wonderful speaker, and really a walking archive himself. And he's covered Jonny, you've covered just so much material in that, and it has really whetted my appetite anyway, whatever about anybody else. And such a diverse range, and the methodology of the origins and the methodology of the collections, and the scope and the width of the collections, and then how it's been treated over time, so that now we have access to so much of it online. I think it's absolutely marvelous. So it's been a wonderful lecture, and thank you, Kieran, for organising it and running the session. And we've a marvellous crowd here tonight. So we've started off with over the last night over 80, and tonight over 90, I think. So we're growing, and what's this to say? Needs must when they. It's a saying. Can't remember the rest of it, but we're doing it online, and when the devil something or other. Anyway, the fairies may be gone, but some of the sayings are around. But this is the second, and more to come. And while I'm at that, I'll just a reminder to people. Our next lecture is on the 22nd of March, and it'll be given by Dr. Diarmuid Wheeler of NUI Galway. He'll be his lecture is entitled "We Adore Chaos Because We Love to Produce Order," and this is about the English colonisation and the Leaks Offaly plantation. Again, it should be very, very, it's all, these lectures are so relevant and so interesting. So another one to look forward to. And don't forget, you can visit us anytime on offalyhistory.com, and you'll have access to the blogs and library, the information about the the society, some of the work we do, and the business we're in, and our premises, and all the big projects that the Offaly History Centre at Blúiríní in Tullamore, and Offaly Archives. So just so much. So we'll be saying goodbye and thank you to you, good night and thank you, and look forward to meeting you all again. And thanks again, Dr. Kieran, for facilitating here tonight and hosting. I think there are even new terms to be learned now. So thank you all very much, and good night.
Thank you very much, Helen. And there's nothing more to say, bar just to echo Helen's words on thanking Jonny for what you, I'm sure you'll agree, was an excellent presentation on this important topic, and on the actual use of this valuable resource, the website Dúchas.ie. And before I finish up, I do want to acknowledge that Jonny was due to speak to us last year, spring of last year, I forget, was it March, April or May? But of course we had to postpone that, so we're quite thrilled that while we couldn't welcome him to Blúiríní in Tullamore, that he did join us this evening and was able to contribute to our lecture programme, and we're very grateful and honoured to him for that. And to thank Jonny and actually his colleagues in the Folklore Collection for, I'm thinking back to one of the quotes from Seamus Delargy that Jonny used about the folklore material being an untapped source. And I think what Jonny and his colleagues are doing are allowing us to tap into this source through their work, and that's I think a great and an honourable and valuable endeavour. So thank you very much again, Jonny, and thanks you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again in a few weeks for Dr. Diarmuid Weir's lecture. So take care.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a million. Great crack.
That was great, Jonny. Really enjoyable.
Good. Happy enough. And if anyone has any queries, just send on my email address if anybody's